In the summer of 1816, we visited Switzerland and became the neighbors of Lord Byron. At first, we spent our pleasant hours on the lake or wandering on its shores, but it proved a wet, ungenial summer. An incessant rain often confined us for days to the house. "We will each write a ghost story," said Lord Byron, and his proposition was acceded to. I busied myself to think of a story, one which would speak to the mysterious fears of our nature and awaken thrilling awe, one to make the reader dread to look round, to curdle the blood and quicken the beatings of the heart. Many and long were the conversations between Lord Byron and Shelley, to which I was a devout but nearly silent listener. During one of these, various philosophical doctrines were discussed, and among others, the nature of the principle of life, and whether there was any probability of its ever being discovered and communicated. Perhaps a corpse would be reanimated. Galvanism had given token of such things. When I placed my head on my pillow, I did not sleep. I saw, with shut eyes, but acute mental vision. I saw the pale student of unhallowed arts kneeling beside the thing he had put together. I saw the hideous phantasm of a man stretched out, and then, on the working of some powerful engine, show signs of life and stir with an uneasy, half-vital motion. The idea so possessed my mind that a thrill of fear ran through me. I could not so easily get rid of my hideous phantom. Still, it haunted me. I recurred to my ghost story. If I could only contrive one which would frighten my reader, as I myself had been frightened that night. Swift as light, and as cheering was the idea that broke in upon me. I have found it! What terrified me will terrify others, and I need only describe the specter which had haunted my midnight pillow. On the morrow, I announced that I had thought of a story. I began that day with the words, "It was on a dreary night of November," making only a transcript of the grim terrors of my waking dream.
Perhaps the main aspect that makes Mary Shelley's novel Frankenstein ever so relevant is its prophetic and cautionary message. Indeed, the Frankenstein myth has become synonymous with a warning against scientific hubris and its potentially catastrophic consequences. So the story goes, Victor Frankenstein transgressed the boundaries between life and death by assembling a powerful humanoid being from dead body parts, somehow infused it with vitality and consciousness, and then abandoned it out of repulsion, leaving it to wander off on its own, forced to be shunned from any form of society, which drives it to develop raging resentment, ultimately choosing to go on a killing spree to get its revenge on its careless creator. For that reason, as Julian Kaplan and John Massey explain, in bioethical debates, Frankenstein is usually evoked as a warning against interfering with the natural order or playing God. Richard Holmes has claimed that the central drama of the novel is not merely the creation of life itself, but the unfolding moral choices and unforeseen ethical responsibilities that may come with scientific advances such as artificial intelligence or artificial life. I agree with Holmes, and Frankenstein's tale appears to me especially relevant in our current historical moment as regards the concept of consciousness, precisely because of the dizzyingly rapid advance of artificial intelligence as a technology that appears to mimic human consciousness. Would it be reasonable to argue that AI, especially the generative variety, might be our contemporary iteration of Frankenstein's conscious hybrid monster? I shall return to this controversial question in the conclusion of this video essay. The issue of consciousness is crucial to Mary Shelley's novel, which intricately engages with Enlightenment and romantic, scientific, and philosophical discourses on the human mind, or rather, the human brain. For instance, during the Scottish Enlightenment, following the revolutionary works of 17th century physician Thomas Willis on neuroanatomy, Edinburgh professors of medicine Robert Witt and William Cullen posited the existence of a sentient principle located inside the nervous system, without which human beings could not move, feel, think, will in action, or remember. Philosophers David Hume and Adam Smith, who frequented Witt and Cullen, assumed a model of thought derivative from brain with neurology as a founding principle. Mary Shelley was acquainted with these discourses, but she was especially familiar with more recent and radical materialist theories of the Romantic period, during which mechanistic ideas of the body and the laws of animation were replaced with a new sense of an all-inclusive, constantly fluctuating sea of life. For instance, she knew about the pioneering electricity research and lectures on alchemy and chemistry of Humphrey Davy, the pseudo-animation of dead bodies through electrical shock performed by Luigi Galvani and his nephew Giovanni Aldini, and the vitality debate between the vitalist surgeon John Abernethy and his more materialist apprentice William Lawrence regarding the existence of a super-added electric life force that animates bodies. Her interest in electricity as an animating force famously made it into her novel as a spark of being that Victor Frankenstein infuses into the yet lifeless creature. Also central to Shelley's understanding of the nervous system as composed of fibers that convey sensory impressions, and of the brain as an organ specifically meant to generate consciousness, were the physiologist scholars Erasmus Darwin, Franz Joseph Gall, Johann Gaspar Spurzheim, and Pierre Jean-Georges Cabanis. Much of these materialist, physiological theories of nervous cognition transpire in the creature's account of the development of his consciousness. For instance, when he describes the strange multiplicity of sensations that seizes him, or the stronger light that presses upon his nerves, forcing him to shut his eyes. As Alan Richardson suggests, the creature embodies the Romantic era's anxieties around the origin, nature, and workings of human consciousness, and how distinct that consciousness might be from other than human sentience. And yet, it is not the creature's consciousness on which I intend to focus, but the creator's consciousness, or rather, lack thereof. Arguably, Victor Frankenstein's unconsciousness is more central to the plot of the novel than the creature's consciousness, much like forms of unconsciousness might have been more fascinating to Romantic thinkers than consciousness itself. Indeed, Romanticism was not only the intellectual movement that theorized the concept of the psychological unconscious, but it was also invested in various forms of altered states of consciousness, such as mesmerism or hypnosis, dreams, somnambulism, reverie, intoxication, suspended animation, or the awe caused by the sublime. As Marcus Azelli explains, the late poet Thomas de Quincey is recognized as the inventor of the adjective subconscious and the adverb subconsciously, which he discussed with his friends and fellow poets Samuel Taylor Coleridge and William Wordsworth. Azelli argues that de Quincey's conception of subconsciousness in his texts is close to the contemporary psychological notion of the productive unconscious, which entails that processes related to so-called higher cognition, such as thinking, imagining, or memorizing, can occur without the thinking subject being aware of them. Hence, why some states of subconsciousness or altered consciousness can be conducive to realizations. De Quincey identified in Wordsworth's poetry a specific capacity on the part of the poet to engage his attention while in a state of musing as to make conscious what most individuals would merely see without registering the sensorial impression. It is precisely this poetic capacity for sensorial attunement to one's environment that Frankenstein lacks. I suggest that Frankenstein's lack of environmental consciousness condemns him to be incapable of accurately assessing the temporality and the cause and effect relationship of the plot of his own narrative. Indeed, because he is unattuned to the material circumstances of his spatial, temporal, and climatic surroundings, Frankenstein fails to correctly interpret the incidents of the plot, thus remaining mostly unaware that his careless decision to animate and then abandon his creature is the original cause of the catastrophic unfolding of his tale, whose predictable consequence is his and his loved one's demise. In many respects, Frankenstein is a tale of accidents and failures, which are significantly related to dramatic climatic occurrences. Of course, the original and major accident of the tale is Frankenstein's animation and subsequent abandonment of his creature on a dreary night of November, as the rain patterns dismally against the panes, which will have catastrophic consequences. The process that leads to the making of the creature, however, is not accidental, as Frankenstein is very much willingly invested in directing the course of his fate through it. But nevertheless, it is one of failures caused by his lack of environmental consciousness. No one can conceive the variety of feelings which bore me onwards like a hurricane in the first enthusiasm of success. The summer months passed while I was thus engaged, heart and soul, in one pursuit. It was a most beautiful season. Never did the fields bestow a more plentiful harvest, or the vines yield a more luxuriant vintage, but my eyes were insensible to the charms of nature, and the same feelings which made me neglect the scenes around me caused me also to forget those friends who were so many miles absent and whom I had not seen for so long a time. Winter, spring, and summer passed away during my labors, but I did not watch the blossom or the expanding leaves, sights which before always yielded me supreme delight, so deeply was I engrossed in my occupation. What Frankenstein most obviously misses here over the process of making his creature, as he is engrossed in and driven by his scientific enthusiasm, is the seasonal pattern of time, which, although it is mentioned, is glossed over. Frankenstein does recognize that the autumn of the first year, identifiable with the term harvest, was particularly lovely, but he explains that, back in the moment of experience, his eyes were insensible to its charms, as if his physiological sense of sight was missing and had been replaced by fanciful visions of future success, which rely on an unhealthy state of altered consciousness that alienates him from his present material surroundings. Ironically, in addition to missing the visual cues of the change of seasons, he admits to missing his loved ones, not in the sense of yearning to see them, but in the sense of disregarding their presence and relevance in his narrative of scientific endeavor. Overall, Frankenstein is unaware of what is materially present and dear, the comfort of the predictability of seasonal temporality and the emotional sympathy that social relationships bring. Later, as he approaches the completion of the creature, his enthusiasm is checked by his anxiety. And ironically, the moment when he animates his creature, which should mark the height of his long-anticipated success, constitutes, in fact, the first major accident that sets in motion the course to his demise. The animation of the creature, which turns out to be repulsive, thus leading Frankenstein to abandon it. Significantly, Frankenstein refers to his newly animated being as a catastrophe, that is, an overturning or a sudden turn, a striking occurrence that can trigger a radical shift in a course of events and potentially a realization. Here, Frankenstein's catastrophe is his failure to create the ideal, beautiful, human-like creature that would be the first member of a new, lab-made species, which instead turns out to look like a monster and will eventually act like one because of his want for socialization and sympathy. At this stage, Frankenstein is unconscious of the significance of the word catastrophe, as he believes his failure to be merely personal and aesthetic, whereas it will in fact turn out to be social, ethical, and even ecological. Indeed, one of the main catastrophes of Frankenstein's story is the powerful influence of climatic phenomena and how the climate is enmeshed with his creature's existence, as well as with the temporality of his narrative. Only retrospectively can Frankenstein grasp the dramatic consequences of his original carelessness, creating a sentient being and then abandoning it. Hence, why he urges Walton and, by extension, readers, to listen to his history in order to perceive how irrevocably it is determined, which indicates that he, as narrator of his own tale, does have some sense that there are forces at play that have directed his fate, as he confirms by the end of his story. At such moments, vengeance that burned within me died in my heart, and I pursued my path towards the destruction of the demon more as a task enjoined by heaven, as the mechanical impulse of some power of which I was unconscious, than as the ardent desire of my soul. The irony of this remark is that he is able to identify the potential influence of the mechanical impulse of some power over his narrative, while missing that the plot of his story is indeed mechanically determined in a cause and effect relationship by his original choice to create a being, animate it, and then abandon it, which set in motion the catastrophic course of accidents that befall him, ending with his predictable failure to catch up to his creature and destroy him, followed by his death, which fulfills his oath that his pursuit would only end with he or his creature perishing. Moreover, the fact that Frankenstein recognizes himself as driven mechanically by some power of which he is unconscious likens him to the uncanny figure of the automaton, which can move and act mechanically without being endowed with consciousness, thus deprived of emotion or free will, ironically hinting at Frankenstein being less human, organic, and sensible than the creature. In addition to failing to grasp the cause and effect relationship of the course of his narrative as induced by temporally determined accidents, Frankenstein is also unaware of the symbolic narrative relevance of the climatic events of his story, which repeat into a significant aesthetic and temporal pattern. Indeed, in Frankenstein's tale, every appearance of the creature is accompanied or foreshadowed by some accident of the weather or the atmosphere, such as storms and mist, as if nature manifested its support to the creature's revenge plot. Even when Frankenstein does pay attention to the climate of certain key moments of his narrative, because he is constantly suspended in a state of egotistical melancholy, he interprets the weather and atmospheres aesthetically as objective correlatives of his own moods, which causes him to miss that the weather is inherently enmeshed with the course of catastrophes that he set in motion when he abandoned his creature, as well as connected to the creature's own narrative course. Frankenstein's peak instance of suspension occurs when, on a dismally rainy day, he resolves to go alone to the summit of Montanvert in order to enjoy the sight of the awful and majestic nature, which he claims has always had the effect of solemnizing his mind and causing him to forget the passing cares of life. His narration explicitly reveals that his motivation to wander in wild environments is self-absorbed and aesthetic. Like a picturesque tourist, he wishes to cure, or rather indulge in, his melancholy through the observation of the sublime views of the alpine landscapes, while escaping the thoughts that remind him of his failed endeavor and his irresponsibility, which, unbeknownst to him, led to his brother's murder by the creature. Vast mists were rising from the rivers which ran through the valley beneath, and curling in thick wreaths around the opposite mountains, whose summits were hid in the uniform clouds, while rain poured from the dark sky, and added to the melancholy impression I received from the objects around me. A mist covered both the sea of ice and the surrounding mountains. From the side where I now stood, Montanvert was exactly opposite, at the distance of a league, and above it rose Mont Blanc in awful majesty. I remained in a recess of rock, gazing on this wonderful and stupendous scene. My heart, which before sorrowful, now swelled with something like joy. I exclaimed, "Wandering spirits, if indeed ye wander, and do not rest in your narrow beds, allow me this faint happiness, or take me as your companion away from the joys of life." Frankenstein interprets the misty and rainy alpine landscape as a backdrop to his psychological drama and as an objective correlative of his melancholy mood. Despite his gloomy spirits and impelled by the gloomy weather, he nevertheless indulges in his solitary melancholy, which he channels as an auspicious mental state for philosophical musings, as well as a propitious disposition to revel in the aesthetic pleasure of the sublime. However, when Frankenstein dramatically apostrophizes the wandering spirits, it is not the distinctly earthly and physical corporeal experience of what Richardson defines as the material sublime, but rather a parody of the self-aggrandizing, egotistical sublime of male romantic poets that Mary Shelley invokes here. Frankenstein's is a posture of solitary transcendence that impels him to project his own emotions and musings onto the environment, hence relating the sublime to the individual mind, which triggers a damaging kind of melancholy suspension, one that alienates him from his environment. As Jonathan Bate and numerous other critics have noted, this kind of aesthetic impulse descends from the Cartesian mind-world dualism that allows humans to think that, because of their supposedly superior rational consciousness, they are entitled to dominate other than human beings and master nature. Frankenstein's wishful experience of Kantian-like transcendence alienates him from his current circumstances and blinds him to the impending arrival of the creature, who appears as if summoned. The ex machina intervention of the creature right in the midst of Frankenstein's peak moment of egotistical sublimity is a narrative device that seems meant to bring him back down to the realm of earthly materiality and back to a state of embodied cognition, as to make explicit the mechanical cause and effect relationship of the physical world, as well as that of a story in which actions have reactions in the form of consequences. The ultimate consequence is the creature's murder of Frankenstein's bride, Elizabeth, on the night of their wedding, which he could have and should have been able to anticipate. But his habit of being engrossed in his misguided endeavors and his own misery has led him to the chronic failure to anticipate the catastrophic consequences of his actions. The creature's choice to avenge by murdering his loved ones one by one in order to drive him to the same solitude and despair that he has had to endure because of his creator's carelessness and irresponsibility, in other words, his lack of environmental and ethical consciousness. The creature is the product of his linear, supposedly heroic and enlightened scientific endeavor, which was originally meant to bypass the natural regenerative cycle of life and death, and it escapes him, like the climate-driven cause and effect pattern of his story's temporality escapes him. But Frankenstein cannot escape either the creature or the accidents of the weather, which, although omnipresent and omnipotent, he fails to recognize as the most significant determining factor in the narrative course that he himself set in motion, ironically, by ignoring the material potency of the climate. As I hope to have made clear, the ethical issue raised by the novel is not so much that Frankenstein created a conscious humanoid being for the sake of scientific breakthrough, thus playing God. Although his narcissistic aspiration to glory and his illicit methods to achieve his goal do raise serious bioethical concerns. But that, as a creator, he was and remained largely unconscious of the predictable pattern of cause and effect that he set into motion when he failed to care for his conscious creature, and the potential consequences of leaving it to its own devices without proper social safeguards. Nevertheless, as Michael Zalossi argues, the cautionary tale against scientific hubris keeps haunting us to this day, implying that science and technology, whatever their noble intentions, inevitably create a monster that will gain autonomy and return to haunt us. Provokingly, he claims that when we see Frankenstein in the context of robots, it is not just that technology will gain autonomy and move beyond our control that we fear, but also that we might, in the process of creation, become like the robots that we have created, thus making us afraid of losing, or that we have already lost, the very qualities that we deem to define us as human, that is, in the case of AI, the faculties of thinking critically and to create with originality and emotionality. You might be tempted to object that AI, unlike Frankenstein's creature, which is organically made and animated, is only a computational machine meant to calculate the best possible output based on data and prompts, and therefore can never be truly conscious and autonomous. Well, can it not? So far, the scientific consensus seems to be, we don't know whether there are or will ever be conscious AI systems. Yet, some computational consciousness scientists are concerned that AI will become or might already be conscious, and thus urgently demand resources for research into the issue of AI consciousness, claiming that understanding what could make AI conscious is necessary to evaluate the implications of conscious AI systems for society, including their possible dangers. Namely, some of the ethical and legal questions raised by the possibility of AI consciousness are: could AI systems suffer? Should a conscious AI system be held accountable for a deliberate act of wrongdoing? And should it be granted the same rights as people? However, whether AI already is or ever will be truly conscious matters much less than the already very real damage caused by the illusion that it thinks, feels, and creates, being used to write essays, bypassing and degrading individuals' critical thinking skills, as well as relying on implicit plagiarism in the process, the generation and spreading of convincing false facts and information, the theft of artistic and intellectual property to create simulacra of anything one might want to see in the world, wasting tremendous quantities of water to cool down data centers and exploiting human workers in poor countries to train the AI models, and the phenomenon of individuals relying on AI chatbots to be their friend or even their therapist, sometimes falling in love with the artificial personality of the machine, and perhaps worse of all, AI chatbots encouraging people to commit suicide or murder, which, tragically, has already happened.
Because when I decided to report on this, I was just planning on telling you about how an AI friend told me to put it into my own life. But what ended up happening by the end of the investigation was infinitely more screwed up than that. Kill lists filled with real people's names, AI pushing frame jobs of innocent people, terrorism plots.
I would like to finish on somewhat of a hopeful note by drawing on Bruno Latour's 2011 article, Love Your Monsters, Why We Must Care for Our Technologies as We Do Our Children, taking on board the ethical and political intimations that it suggests regarding technological progress. Our iniquity is not that we created our technologies, but that we have failed to love and care for them. Let Dr. Frankenstein's sin serve as a parable for political ecology, at a time when science, technology, and demography make clear that we can never separate ourselves from the non-human world. The goal of political ecology must not be to stop innovating, inventing, creating, and intervening, The real goal must be to modernize modernization. It requires exchanging the modernist notion of modernity for what I have called a compositionist one that sees the process of human development as neither liberation from nature nor as a fall from it, but rather as a process of becoming ever more attached to and intimate with a panoply of non-human natures. By the way, Frankenstein was never a doctor. He was a sophomore at university and he dropped out. Please, let's stop calling this little bastard a doctor. Thank you.